thoughtful ideas and suggestions for guests and topics.
Great events, programs, the student faculty, all the
Good afternoon and welcome to this week's segment of Dialogue Houston. I'm your host, Lawrence Payne. To our regular viewing audience, welcome. To those joining us here, perhaps for the first time for HCC's TV Dialogue Houston, we can be found now every Tuesday and Thursday at 6 a.m. and again at 6 p.m. and Saturday afternoons at 3 p.m. As always, at the top of the hour, let me thank you for your thoughtful calls, emails, and text messages concerning previous shows we've aired here on HCC's TV Dialogue Houston, where after all, this is your community affairs, public affairs show, proudly now in its 30th season, and we look forward to bringing you great programming this year. We also look forward always to getting your suggestions and ideas for topics and guests to be covered on upcoming segments of Dialogue Houston. I have a real great conversation set up for you this afternoon with someone who I think you're going to really enjoy. I've looked forward to having Scott on Dialogue Houston. Let me just tell you a little bit about him, and then we're going to dive into the world of work today and the wonderful world of work and the future of work. My guest is Dr. Scott Sonenshein, who is a New York Times best-selling author. He is a professor of management at Rice University at the Jesse Jones School. He is a consultant to Fortune 500 companies, and they use his work and his research in their endeavor to become better companies. He specializes in organizational behavior and change and leadership, narratives to help move things forward, social influence, creativity, and social issues. He is the author of Stretch, Unlock the Power of Less, Achieve More Than You Ever Imagined. I love that title. And also the second book is The Joy of Work, Organizing Your Professional Life, How to Find Joy in Life in Your Work Life. Some articles that I want to point out to you, one of them particularly I enjoyed reading, and I love the title, Don't Bring Your Work Mess Home. It's a wise piece of information just to be able to have peace in the household. And on a recent podcast with Brene Brown, why we'll never be the same again and why it's time to talk about it. The whole change of work under her podcast entitled the series Dare to Lead. So I'm just happy and proud to have Scott join us this afternoon. So welcome, Scott.
Thanks so much for having me, Larry.
Oh, this is great. So let's just dive in. The world of work, the future of work, the reality of work with the pandemic and a George Floyd post-world, racial disparities, hiring, aging workforce, changing demographics, immigration curves to bring into some of the people we need, the D&I programs. I mean, there's just so much going on. So kind of give us an update. Where are we? What's the future looking like?
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot you mentioned, and it really shows what we've been through in the past 2 years or now. It's been a lot, both as a country, as a community, and certainly as a workforce, as people from all over the world are trying to figure out how do we manage what work looks like in an environment where maybe we're not going to be back in the office as regularly as we have been before and see our coworkers. What does it look like to work in a community that's been ever changed by a pandemic that has caused so much pain and suffering among so many people? And then finally, what does it mean to work in a organization and in a broader community where since post George Floyd, the topic of race and race relations has been front and center in the American workforce. So those are three distinct issues, but they're very much interrelated, and they've just been part of what Americans and Houstonians have been having to wrestle with in the last couple of years.
Have we lost a lot by not being able to have that daily face-to-face interaction, that being able to be with other human beings and discuss these issues, both that pertain to work and pertain to societal issues? Because it seems to me it just isn't the same in the internet world and the Zoom world.
Yeah, I think we have lost some things. I think people went through different types of phases. I think there's some differences here. Some people are more extroverted and really crave and appreciate that ongoing contact. Some people are more introverted, and we're probably pretty happy when we first shifted to Zoom in March 2020. But I'd say after 2 years of this, many people, certainly not all people, but many people are getting the sense of they do miss those relationships, being able to have those face-to-face conversations. The type of dialogue that you have in face-to-face interactions, no doubt, is a much richer form of communication. Technologies like Zoom certainly can try and approximate that, but it is no replacement for that face-to-face interaction. Now, I think as we look at what's happened with the world of work, we've realized, though, that do we need that face-to-face interaction on a day-to-day basis? If we were going to go ahead and design what a workday looked like starting from scratch, having the benefit of what's unfolded in the past 2 years, I don't think we would end up at thinking about work as something you show up to a physical building 9 to 5, 5 days a week for knowledge workers. I think that's a pretty bizarre statement to make after what we've been through. Having said that, I don't think that means that the future of work is going to be completely remote. For some industries, certainly that might work. But for many industries, we do need that face-to-face contact. What most of the research says is that the magic number is about 2.5 days of in-person interaction. That's needed to keep relationships strong, be able to really bond and be cohesive as a team. It really depends too on the type of work that you're doing. There's some work that really is just better suited for remote work. If you're doing something that requires deep thought and creativity by yourself, you don't really want to be in an office where there's a lot of distractions. But on the other hand, there's plenty of work that requires collaboration, and collaboration in person is a much richer form of communication most of the time.
Has the attention and the efforts to really create a workforce or workplace environment that really takes in the issues that D&I deals with, diversity, equity, inclusion, has that suffered in this post world of hybrid, of some people being able to be in, some not, and not having that interaction? It seems to me that would be one of the major, I won't use the word casualties, but one of the major things that have suffered because of not being able to be with that interaction on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little mixed here. I mean, certainly the salience of DE&I has increased substantially in the last 2 years. Not so much because of the pandemic, but because of the unfolding events that have occurred on the same timeline. The challenge, though, with remote work and return to the office is that some people are just structurally disadvantaged at being able to go to the office on a regular basis, especially during the time of the pandemic. So let's say you don't have childcare available. Working remotely allows you to continue contributing, and especially if everyone else is contributing, not feeling both personally as well as from other people making assessments of you that you're not pulling your weight here. But if you don't have that childcare, or you don't have the opportunity to be able to come into the office, in many senses, having a work model that's remote does equalize many aspects of some of these structural problems. But I'm not sure that that's necessarily the best way to solve these structural problems. I think, ideally, from an organization perspective, we would like to see that face-to-face contact. So I don't think the answer to some of our problems around inequity, around funding early childhood development is let's just make work remote so parents can both work and watch the kids at the same time. It's pretty hard to do one of those things well, let alone two of those things well. So I don't want us to get to the point where remote work is going to be the answer and people should just be doing everything from at home, and that way they can use their left hand to watch their children and their right hand to actually work. That's not the way we want this to work. Right.
So in the larger scheme of things, how has organizational effectiveness been affected? I mean, I've always been taught that the four constraints from a business perspective about organizational effectiveness is mission, power, structure, and resources. And when we use the word power here, we always remind everyone that everyone has power. Some people just have more power than others. But how has those four pillars, traditional four pillars, been affected by this new reality that we're in now?
Well, we really went through some phases. I think early in the pandemic, there was so much uncertainty and such tremendous constraints. You saw, of course, a lot of layoffs and downsizing. The labor market was decimated early in the pandemic, and it was really just a fit for survival with, not the sense of what was going to be the light at the end of the tunnel? Was there ever going to be a light at the end of the tunnel? Sometime around the midpoint of the pandemic, though, things really shifted, and the power dynamics of the labor market began to shift, and organizations were able to adapt and adjust, or I should say some of them were able to adapt and adjust and start to capitalize on some of the larger changes in the economy by changing their business models. And where we're left at this point today is a place where labor is in one of the strongest positions it's been in decades. I mean, we've seen a historical decline with the power of the labor union to be able to drive workers' rights. But now we're in a place where it's so hard to hire in many industries that you're finally seeing steady wage growth and organizations being much more attuned to the needs of their employees, not just at work, but kind of the broader needs that they have in wrestling with some of the personal challenges that have inevitably come up during the pandemic. And so, one of the things that I'm optimistic for and hopeful for, that's a consequence of the pandemic, is the sense that labor finally is on a stronger footing.
So, what's the next great pivot you see that we're going to have to do? I mean, the word pivot came into play with the pandemic and in the post-George Floyd reality also. A lot of people who were able to adapt and change and pivot were able to be successful and continue and grow and re-examine. So what's the next great pivot or change that you see coming down the wire?
I think it's really going to be about how they interact with a workforce that is forever change. It's forever change because the pandemic has increased what psychologists call mortality salience, the sense that we have a finite amount of time on this planet. Just about everyone was either directly or indirectly touched by some type of pain or suffering during the pandemic, and that has made people in the workforce really begin to rethink their choices that they're making in terms of what they're doing at work, how frequently they're doing it, and how they're doing it. So as I look on the horizon and think about what are the organizations that are going to be able to thrive in kind of the next 5 to 10 years, it's going to be those organizations that are mindful and creative and being in tune with these needs. The workforce doesn't, it's not the same workforce that it was 2 years ago, and organizations that are narrowly focused on their own needs and not the needs of labor are going to end up paying in the long term.
So let's focus a little bit on the needs of labor and the needs of the worker and the employee. Where do you see this whole discussion about inequities in the workforce and equities in outcomes? Where is that headed? Because I think the D&I stuff again has been kind of wrestling with in the response to the George Floyd reality for the last 2 years of what it really wants in its goals and outcomes. And I think it has focused a lot on the issue of diversity and inclusion without a lot of focus on the equity piece, because I think the equity piece really is the piece that's going to make the other two work. And how do we create that empathetic world? Because my take always is that the road to equity is empathy. There is no equity without empathy. And so we have seen some organizations and corporations care more about their employees since the pandemic. Others who are kind of returning now again back to business as usual. There was this great kind of outpouring of concern and care, and now things are kind of dying down and going back to the way they was. How do you see that being played out?
Yeah, I think if organizations take a long-term view, this sense of many of these issues going away, I don't think they are going away. I mean, you are definitely seeing disparate responses to some of these initiatives where some companies are trying to do the bare minimum and just look like they are, let's call it, symbolically compliant with what society has come to expect of them. And what I mean by that is, maybe they're doing at the margin a little more diverse hiring or making statements. Well, I think the workforce is a lot smarter than a lot of organizations realize, and increasingly the workforce wants to work at a place that shares and espouses the same values. And as the values of our communities have shifted to care a lot more substantially about issues around diversity, organizations need to create environments where people feel good about working for their companies. I think this era of separating your personal self from the self that you bring to work, I think that was already on the way out with kind of the new generations, Generation Z, and certainly the millennials have been much more mindful of not having this split personality between your work self and your personal self. And I think the pandemic has only exacerbated that. So I think organizations really need to start making a decision, which is, are we just doing this for symbolic reasons? And if they are, I don't think they're going to perform well in the long term, because they're going to have a hard time attracting the type of talent that they need to tackle the increasingly complex problems that they're going to face. Or alternatively, are they going to start making systematic changes to the very fabric of how they do business? Not just something that the marketing department or the HR department puts out, but intertwined with their core operations. Are they going to be more attuned to the diversity that's in the communities in which they're doing business with and in which they're drawing labor from?
And I totally agree with you, and thank you for that. You brought up an interesting perspective that in our personal and professional lives, as those two dovetail and not as separate as they once were and come together in the play, where the rub seems to be happening is in the third sphere of our lives, our public life, our personal, professional, and public lives. We all have all three. That the issues in the public arena that people feel passionate about, that they bring to the workplace for discussions or dialogue that happens to come out lots of times in these great D&I discussions, is where the rub seems to come around the societal issues and those particularly that deal with justice, and everybody has a different perspective and take on justice. And then if I add the word social justice to it, it really changes again the whole dynamics of people's understanding and definition. But how do we connect, or begin to feel comfortable with being able to discuss in our workplace environment with people we're developing a cohort relationship with, of mutual trust and respect, of these great impactful issues in our society that need and want to be talked about, but seem still to be taboo in the workplace. And you see now corporations pivoting again and pushing back against gay rights, against all kinds of other issues. Is that going to change? Is that going to be looked at a little differently going forward, or what? Or is that always just going to remain kind of taboo?
Well, we've definitely seen a trend in the last 15 or 20 years with business organizations being a bit less shy about entering the public sphere and advocating for social issues. It started really with environmental issues, was probably the primary issue. But as you pointed out, more recently, there's been a lot of corporate backlash in the last 5 to 7 years about LGBTQ rights. You've had the so-called bathroom bills, like in North Carolina, where you saw a lot of corporate pushback. You saw something similar happen in Indiana as well. And in many respects, business organizations have been at the forefront of trying to advance some of these social issues. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is their workforces are increasingly diverse, and they're calling for action on these types of issues. And they're worried about being able to attract talent in communities that have laws that are not tolerant and representative of the broader community. And I think, another kind of trend that we've seen more recently is this idea that business organizations have, historically tried to shy away from anything that was a bit contentious. But I think they've increasingly come to realize that they don't have a choice, because a lot of these issues are not being solved by government institutions. I mean, historically, this would be a place for a public square and for government to tackle these issues. And in at least a number of, especially at the state level, state legislations, you have seen taking away rights. And companies, surprisingly, have kind of been on the defending line of some of those key rights. Now, I think there's a more philosophical question that we ought to be asking, however, which is, do we really want to outsource so much of our social policy to a bunch of for-profit business entities? I think that's a kind of dangerous game to get into. But the reality is, at least in a number of states, that really has been the last line of defense for some of these business organizations. And more recently, I think some state legislations and administrators have taken notice of the impact that corporations have been having. You just take, for example, what's happening in Florida right now with Disney and the punishment that it's getting for speaking out against an anti-gay piece of legislation. And so you're beginning to now see government tussle with with business organizations over social policy, which again is something I would not have definitely predicted 20 years ago. You wouldn't think that the interface of business and government is where all the action is on social policy, and it's surprising, potentially a little worrisome, but it has been somewhat effective for some of these issues as of late.
Well, you mentioned the Florida issue with Disney and the backlash that's been going on there around these issues. But ExxonMobil recently, with the rainbow flag and the gay pride parade, backtracked on their statement about how they're going to allow their employees to use the flag, et cetera. And it seems to me that these are issues that I thought we had discussed, not necessarily won, but that we had kind of put behind us. And I see this kind of coming back to the discussion with a new negative reaction and a new response, kind of puzzling, because I thought those gains had been made, that understanding had been won, that educational process had happened, and people, and then to see them truly just backtrack and really do an appeasement and a lip service, and the explanation that they gave makes really no real sense. And so I just find it very interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's certainly disappointing. I mean, in Texas too, you had, of course, relative silence on some of the anti-abortion legislation that came out earlier in the year, and that was also a bit surprising given the recent trends we've had. I think, Larry, the one thing I can really point to is that you've seen a lot of, especially Republican legislatures and politicians, start to try and systematically punish business for speaking out, and that's putting them in a pretty difficult position because, on one hand, they're being receptive to their employee population and their communities, which overwhelmingly support many of these issues. On the other hand, they're being punished financially, in many respects, pretty handedly financially, for taking a stance on these issues. So perhaps we're going to start to see some reticence in speaking out on these issues in the not too distant future.
Scott, our time has gone by way too quickly and too soon. So we have about 30 seconds left. So I'm going to give you a chance to have the last word, and quickly anything that you want to make sure that you touched on that we haven't been able to talk about.
Yeah, I think we have a real opportunity as we come out of the pandemic to have a kind of reconfiguration of what work means. And so one of the things that I'm most hopeful for is that we get a do-over, and that business organizations can be much more attuned with the needs of its labor force and its surrounding community, and actually make a difference not just to their bottom line, but to all of our lives.
I apologize to you. We actually have a little bit more time than I thought, as I just received a message in my ear. So let me ask one other question, since we have that extra time. In this going forward, what do you think community and citizens can do to really bridge, it's not so much the gap, but bridge the reality of their three spheres of their lives, personal, professional, and public, and begin to make that connection and inroads of how those three overlap and work together, and to the benefit of the human being who can work through and understand how those three work and affect their lives and how they live it out every day? Is there something that can be done to help, maybe insight, to give insight to help people understand how that connection works?
Well, these are all interconnected spheres, and I think that starts with trying to find places to work that are really supportive of your values, and to recognize that when you have power in the labor market, like many people do right now, that you can use that as a seed for trying to inspire change, and to find places of work that not only you can be economically successful, but also you can be successful in terms of your whole self. And the hope is that business organizations will respond in kind and be receptive to the different needs of its employees.
And no one should be unhappy at work, right?
There are definitely times where people have bad days. There's no question about it. But in general, we should be finding satisfaction with our work.
Should be joy. Shouldn't be stressed out. Shouldn't be tension every day. Shouldn't be drama. It shouldn't be all those things. Like you say, we all have good days and bad days. But when it's constant and consistent, something's got to go. I'm sorry. It's time. It seems to me it's time for a change. Life is too short. One should be happy and have joy.
Yeah, well, we certainly have seen a big mental health crisis during the last 2 years in the pandemic with everyone, but especially with people who work, and that's been another potentially big consequence of the pandemic is that the workforces and organizations are much more attuned to the mental health needs of their employees, and I hope that's something that continues because it's certainly a serious problem. And I certainly hope long are gone the days where we just literally work people to death, and we don't take into account that they are humans and they have needs and they have worth, and they're just not disposable assets.
And mental health is such a big piece too. I'm glad you touched on that. It really has affected many people in the pandemic post world or current world. And I think we don't spend enough time realizing that, talking about that, and focusing on the needs of individuals and workers from the mental health perspective. I think that it has been silent. A lot of people don't want to talk about it, don't want to raise it, they don't want to seek help. There are all kind of assistant programs at most workplaces to be able to help you, but you have to be willing to ask for that help. And it's not a thing to be ashamed of anymore. It's not an embarrassment. It's not a weakness. It is a reality. And I think that that mental health piece, as you said, is so important to focus on.
Right, and it shouldn't be stigmatized. I mean, right? That's the thing. People don't ask for help because they're worried about being stigmatized, especially at work, and that's something that needs to change.
Yep. All right, Scott, and we're out of time for real this time. And I want to thank you so much for being part of Dialogue Houston. Obviously, we're going to have to do this again, where we can dive a little deeper into some other related subject matters. But I want to thank you for being on this week's guest of Dialogue Houston. And we look forward to following you in your work. And please look up his books and look up his work, and just go to his website. You can find him there. And it's a great ability to have insight, have someone like Scott to help us kind of work through this whole understanding of where we're going as human beings and relationships to other human beings in our workplace, in our lives, our daily lives, or professional lives, personal lives, and public lives. So let me end with this thought around inclusion. Inclusion isn't about sometimes comfort of the majority, or inclusion around making people feel that this is something we have to do. Inclusion is really about supporting, listening, and ultimately incorporating the views and voices that have been suppressed way too long. I think when I talk to workers and employees, as I do many times, about their reality at work, particularly the implementation of DE&I, there's a lot of frustration and tension because they don't see the bar changing or the needle moving, and there's a lot of talk and discussion. And I think whether it's around the D&I issues or just the work life in general, the work life issues in general, people want to be heard, they want to be listened to, they want to be respected, they want to understand that their voices matter and that they are treated as human beings in every aspect of their reality. And I think that's really where this is headed in the long run. I think if we can do that, what is the fair and ethical treatment of all human beings? All human beings' lives matter, all human beings are equal. That's embedded in this whole discussion about the future world that we're going to be working in a more diversified, a more changing demographics reality. And so we look forward to having these kind of dialogues with you every week around where we're headed as human beings and in our common humanity and what's best for our common good in a democracy as citizens. So again, I want to thank Scott for being with us. We look forward to you joining us in weeks to come. And until then, as always, be safe, be strong, and peace, power, and love.
The faculty at HCC represents the best of the city. They're committed to getting our students to their goals. HCC, for everyone, anytime, anyway.